Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today as we talk about recruiting new volunteer leaders. This is Susan Leonard with the Alumni Association, and I'm really excited to take this time to discuss tools and strategies that will help your team be successful with finding new volunteers. In this session, we'll cover a couple different ways to look at recruitment as a whole, based on where your team is currently, being cognizant of the differences among our networks and groups across the country. Then we'll look at where your team is now and if you're currently set up to be successful with bringing new volunteers into the fold. This will give you some things to think about as you look to implement some new strategies for long-term success. Of course, we'll talk about ways to assess what your needs are so that you're recruiting the right kind of people in the right way, followed by how to then make the ask to those people you've identified. We'll also talk a little bit about the onboarding process from our side at the Alumni Association, as well as things for your team to do to train your new volunteers. And we'll end with some final thoughts and troubleshooting. So let's get started. First, I want to acknowledge the differences among our networks and groups. I know that there's a whole spectrum of where you fall in terms of leadership. Some are being managed by a single person who's been holding the reins for many years, and others have a solid rotation of leaders with defined roles. You all are going to look at recruitment differently based on where you are, what your needs are, so I want to call attention to that, and we certainly understand and appreciate those differences. Much of what we'll be covering today, though, might be aspirational, but I hope that you're able to consider implementing at least one new idea right away with the intention of then improving more and more over the coming years. What I don't want is for anyone to think that there's just no way to get to the aspirational point, and so you fall back to just maintaining the status quo. I think there are some simple things you can implement now and eventually build on. Now, I'm going to split the goals into two separate categories based on where you're currently at. The simple strategy for recruiting, and then the comprehensive strategy. The simple strategy would be for those groups that have a small team of leaders, probably don't have any potential volunteers in mind, and you don't really have much in the way of defined expectations laid out in terms of roles and term lengths. For you, I ask that you look into implementing 1 to 3 new ideas from this training, particularly from the ideas that will set you up for success later on, and really think about what's going to help your team's efficiency through these changes. Those that do already have a stronger team in place might look at the comprehensive strategy. You probably have a few potential volunteers in mind, the roles you have and are looking to fill are fairly well defined, and you have a solid idea of what your year ahead looks like. For these groups, I ask that you consider how your current procedures might be improved by the suggestions in this session. Make sure your team reflects the diversity of the alumni in your area, and think about how you can look at recruiting year-round so there are always qualified new leaders ready to join the team. For any team, I want you to think about how your overall operations have set you up for success in recruiting new volunteers. It might help to step back and think about what it takes for an organization to feel inviting to you. What would it take for you to take on a new volunteer role? Now, there are certainly those quote-unquote unicorn volunteers that raise their hand to jump in without any information, no experience with the group, and ready to take the role from 0 to 60 with little help or oversight. Maybe you are one of those volunteers, and you expect everyone else feels the same way. But that is very rarely the case. For most volunteers, they want to know that they will have the support and the guidance they need to learn the ropes, that there's a clear path for their involvement, and they usually want to know the general feel for the team before committing to anything. Now, these ideas and suggestions are really long-term or lifestyle adjustments. You may not be able to implement all of these strategies immediately or even before you begin recruiting, but the more you can set your team up for success, the easier it will be to recruit new volunteers on an ongoing basis. So ask your group these questions. 1, is the team welcoming to new volunteers? If you're not prepared to bring new people onto your team in a welcoming and inviting way, then anyone that does raise their hand likely won't stick around for long. Being open to new ideas and suggestions and allowing new volunteers to take ownership of tasks will go a long way in terms of helping someone to feel like part of the team. 2, is your elevator pitch prepared? If alumni don't know that there are openings on the leadership team, they won't know that they can raise their hand to begin with. You should be sharing info about the network or group as a whole, as well as opportunities to get involved with all alumni, both those you just meet and those that have been attending many of your events. If you need help crafting your elevator pitch, there is a great resource in the Leaders Resource Guide from our 2017 Leadership Georgia Tech Conference to guide you through the process. 3, do you have clear expectations for the team? As a GT alum, any new volunteer wants to know what their role is and what the expectations are of being part of the team. A position description that outlines the commitment, goals, and responsibilities will ensure everyone is on the same page. Your leadership meetings are also an opportunity to establish norms for the team as a whole and how you'll work together to work towards the missions of the Alumni Association and the Institute. 4, do you have an annual calendar? This might be one of those aspirational points to look to implement over the next year or so, but this will really help to guide both what roles you need on your team and how to place volunteers when they raise their hands. For instance, if you have someone say that they really want to help, looking at your annual calendar can give you some ideas for where to plug this person in. Maybe they would make a great addition to the panel event you have next quarter, or they could scout out a location for the fall's game watchings. Or maybe you could use some help with making phone calls for the social events that have been lightly attended. Number 5, do you have a succession plan? Another very important piece for your network or group to establish, if you don't already have plans in place, is to determine what happens at the end of each role's term. What happens if a volunteer moves away or otherwise has to step down from their role? It is critical to have someone in line to take on the president role, such as a president-elect, so that there is a seamless transition from one term to another, or if the president role becomes vacant for any reason. You'll want to make sure that this plan also includes creating a process for maintaining historical records and documents to pass along so that there's no reason to recreate the wheel with each new leadership team. Now, generally speaking, you can't just ask someone, hey, want to volunteer, without having an idea of how exactly they can get involved. Maybe you have a lot of opportunities for new volunteers to plug in and there is genuinely an anything goes atmosphere, but they are going to ask, what do you need or how can I help? And you need to be prepared with a solid, non-wishy-washy answer if you want to recruit some solid leaders. Sitting down with your current team and defining what it is that the team needs to move forward is the very first step to recruitment. You need to know the kind of person you're trying to reach before you can begin the process of making the ask. For example, filling a finance chair position and a social media chair position will likely need 2 very different strategies because they need 2 very different people. For a social media chair, you might start with keeping an eye on those that are frequently interacting with your social media posts and who seem to have an active presence on social media as well. And posting about the open position to social media is going to be the best bet to find some good candidates for that role. The finance chair, on the other hand, might take some networking at your events to find out who has a career in finance or something similar, or maybe even looking through LinkedIn or our student records to identify those with experience managing club or activity books. Individual and direct asks will likely yield better results than posting an all call about this open position. And similarly, if your team is looking for a recent grad to join your more experienced team, or if you think the perspective of a retired alum would add value to your team, you will need to change the recruitment strategy to reach those particular people. So mostly I want you to recognize that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution here. By asking your team the questions on this slide, you'll begin to think about the persona of the ideal candidate or candidates to best complete the team. First, decide what kind of role the team needs. We suggest having at least a president-elect, and a finance chair if you have a bank account. But other common positions include communications chair, events chair, or young alumni ambassador. If you don't already have a working position description for the positions on your team, check out the examples in the Online Leaders Resource Guide or the Toolkit. These will give you an idea of where to start and what kinds of considerations to make for the different roles. Once you know what role you're looking for, think about what specific traits you want and/or need in the leader. Dedicated and reliable are important traits for any leader, but experience with planning and hosting events will be critical for an events chair. Also think about the traits that will round out the team. Maybe your team could also use a competent public speaker to make announcements at your event. Or maybe your team is filled with all young alumni and you could use the perspective of someone who's more advanced in their career. Again, once you have this information, you can then determine the most effective way to reach the ideal candidates for the open roles. Here's also a list of people you might think of to begin narrowing down potential candidates. Look at who's coming to your events. Does the Alumni Association have suggestions from former student leaders or new alumni? Do you know someone personally who could be a good fit? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but should hopefully give you some guidance as you start looking. Now I know you're probably hoping for a single template that will magically draw those unicorn volunteers in, but unfortunately I just don't believe that exists. If you happen to find it, I would love to know, but making the ask will take different forms based on what you're looking for. In the meantime, here are some things to consider before determining how to proceed. That elevator pitch that we discussed at the beginning, where are you at on that? Did you have a way of positively describing how the group operates and what the team needs to move forward? That is absolutely step one here, because if you find yourself often lamenting to other alumni about how difficult it is to plan events or how you'd accept literally anyone to take over for you, you probably won't have success in recruiting someone new. So once you have that, take what your team has agreed upon and compiled in terms of the ideal candidate for your open position or positions. Is that candidate someone who is likely to be watching your social media? Do they fall into the quote-unquote email reading demographic? Are they at all your events? Well, it's certainly not a bad idea to cover your bases and market the volunteer opportunity in all of these ways. You do want to be aware of which avenue is going to be most effective so you can direct the majority of your time and energy accordingly. Now, we can help by drafting some email language, but that is only going to reach so many people. Our email open rates are really high for industry standards, but they are still only in the 25 to 30% range. So you are only ever going to reach a quarter or a third of alumni at best through that route. It is really up to you and your team there on the ground to make the direct asks if you want to reach the broader alumni group. Use social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, phone calls, direct asks at your events, and do not assume that people will proactively come to you if they're interested in getting involved. People like to be asked individually. This is also something that you should be considering year-round and not just when someone has to vacate their position or you're ending your term. If this is part of your elevator pitch, you should be steadily getting the word out so that there's never an urgency or rush to fill a role with the first person who raises their hand. For the majority of networks, I imagine you feel lucky when you have a single person raise their hand for a role, and so you're not even thinking about the idea of taking applications. If you continue to implement some of these small strategies, though, you might find that you are in a solid place to accept applications on an annual basis in order to fill each role with the best fit rather than feeling like you need to accept just anyone, and we'll talk about that a little later. Even if you're not quite there yet, introducing a nominations process could be a game changer for you. This allows anyone to suggest to you people that they think would make a great addition to the team and gives you a really easy way to broach the topic with someone. Instead of having to effectively cold call someone about the role, you can begin the conversation by saying, "Hey, so-and-so recommended you for this role and thinks you'd be a great fit." This changes the whole tone of the conversation. Wouldn't you be more likely to say yes if you were being approached in that very flattering way? Now, moving forward with the assumption that the recruitment went well and you have a new volunteer in place, I want to touch on the onboarding process. Having this knowledge and planning for this stage should help you as you recruit. As we mentioned earlier, having a solid plan in place and being prepared to answer questions will make any potential volunteer more likely to say yes. First, know that we have an onboarding process for orienting new network and group volunteers to the Alumni Association. We cover things like the support structures we have in place, event planning tips, and an overview of what we expect of the team. Basically, we want to establish a connection with all of our volunteers so they know who we are as staff at the Alumni Association. We also have a more in-depth onboarding process for new presidents that cover more details for leading a team and helping to ensure operations tie back to the mission. While these processes cover a lot of great info, nothing can replace the finite details of your individual group's operations. Please be prepared to share critical information, historical records, and expectations for involvement from the get-go with your new volunteers, and continue monitoring progress in the role until you're confident they both have and understand the tools needed to be successful on the team. This ties right back around to setting everyone up for success. Of course, things don't always go as planned though, do they? Sometimes, despite your best efforts, you might still not identify any new strong recruits. Though many of the things we've suggested in this session should prevent you from finding yourself in this spot, we know that there are occasionally circumstances outside our control. Continue with those strategies, and we can work with you to determine if there are other opportunities for recruitment. I also want to stress that while we want to allow as many alumni to get involved as are interested, that does not mean that every alum is going to be right for every open position. If you can find or create a role for an alum that adds value and supports the goals of the group, then that's great. But you do need to acknowledge that there may not always be a good fit. For those cases, it's important to continue keeping the alum as engaged as possible in whatever capacity is available, and being open and honest about respecting everyone's time and talents. I do hope that you know that we're here to support you however you need. This session covers a lot of info, but at the same time, it really just scratches the surface as a very high overview of what it takes to keep your leadership team progressing forward. We fully recognize that your specific group may need to tweak some things or look at things from a different angle. Please, please, please contact us if you have any questions or need to talk anything out. We want to help your team be successful, but we may not be able to help if we don't know what you need. And finally, I'll end with a couple helpful links for good measure. This first one is a resource from alumnifutures.com. I am a firm believer in not recreating the wheel, and I always do some research to find out if what I'm looking to create actually already exists. Now, I wasn't able to find a video training of recruiting volunteers specifically for alumni networks and groups. But this article captures the importance of setting yourself up for success and covers a lot of really great key tactics for recruitment, all in a consolidated list. I didn't manage to cover everything in this session, so please be sure to check it out and consider using it as a helpful guide. And then, of course, I couldn't not add the gtalumni.org/toolkit for our online leaders resource guide. There are a ton of trainings, templates, and guides here, so please remember to take a look every now and then, and especially if you're in planning mode. I referenced a few specific resources in this session, so be sure to bookmark it for future use. Thank you for joining me for this session on volunteer leader recruitment. Again, I know there was a lot of information shared here, but you may have specific questions on how your particular network can begin their recruitment process. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me by email or phone. I look forward to hearing from you soon. Go Jackets!